The morning sun rose with no warmth for the barefoot woman walking down the dry frontier road. Dust clung to her ankles like the memories of everything she'd lost. Her name was Miss Clara Rose, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, the town of Broken Bluff saw her only as the orphaned teacher, forgotten, unpaid, and unneeded. She had once taught their children to write their names, recite poetry, and pray before meals, but when the new mayor deemed her too old-fashioned, she was dismissed without warning. Left with no savings and no family, Clara moved into the abandoned blacksmith's shed near the edge of town. Her clothes were mended by candlelight, her meals were stretched from stale bread and kindness, and her shoes, once a gift from her mother, were wearing so thin she could feel every stone beneath her heels. That morning, Clara saw a girl shivering beside the well. The child's feet were cracked and bleeding, her toes curled inward from walking barefoot too long. Clara's heart didn't think, her hands just moved. She unlaced her only shoes, still stitched with thread from a time when her mother was alive, and placed them on the girl's feet. The girl gasped, but said nothing. Clara smiled, turned, and walked away. Now she walked the rest of the road barefoot, not knowing she had just handed away her last protection, but given someone else their first chance. By noon, the sun was cruel. Her feet blistered on the hot stones, and yet Clara didn't stop. She had promised the widow by the river she'd come teach her two boys how to read. The townspeople watched her pass, some with pity, others with scorn, none offering a word. Her legs trembled as she reached the widow's cabin, but she taught the boys anyway, voice steady, letters drawn in the dirt with her finger, each syllable soaked in courage. Word of what Clara did reached the sheriff's office by sunset. A stranger had come to town, a drifter with sharp boots and a sharper tongue, and had struck the shoeless girl by the well, accusing her of begging near his wagon. The sheriff had intervened just in time, pulled the man away, and noticed the girl's shoes, neatly tied, too large for her feet, too fine for her to own. When the sheriff asked where she got them, the girl pointed toward the hills and whispered, "She gave them to me." That night, Clara hobbled back to her shed, feet swollen and raw. She lit a candle, tore a piece of cloth from her petticoat, and bandaged her toes in silence. The wind blew outside like a song only she could hear. She didn't know that her sacrifice had already started rippling through the town like a storm building on the horizon. Because sometimes, what you give in silence echoes louder than words. And far across the ridge, the sheriff saddled his horse and rode into the night, toward the woman who gave away her shoes, when no one else dared to give anything at all. The sheriff rode with the kind of purpose that made townsfolk turn their heads, though no law had been broken and no wanted poster fluttered in his hands. His horse's hooves struck the road like a clock counting down to something irreversible. He didn't speak, didn't slow, didn't stop. Not until he reached the edge of town where the blacksmith's old shed leaned against the hillside like it had given up breathing. Inside, Clara lay asleep on the floor, one hand on her heart, the other beneath her cheek, her feet bandaged with trembling fabric that had once held books and dreams. The sheriff dismounted and stood at the door without knocking. He watched through the crack in the wood as the woman stirred in her sleep and flinched when her heel brushed the ground. Something in him tightened, a mixture of fury and sorrow, and when he turned back toward town, the decision was already made. By morning, the sheriff was not in his office. The people noticed, but no one asked. Instead, whispers grew. A few spoke of the shoeless woman who walked into the hills to teach for free. Others remembered how she used to pray over their children, how she never took more than she needed, and how none of them had stood up for her when she was dismissed. The guilt hung in the air like ash after a fire. Meanwhile, Clara woke to pain that twisted through her legs like coiled wire. She winced as she pulled herself upright and reached for her shawl, clutching it like armor against the morning chill. Her stomach growled, but the cupboard was bare. just like the money box where she used to collect donations for orphaned students. Still, she stood. Still, she packed her books. Still, she prepared to walk. Outside, the wind had softened, as if offering her a chance. She took a step, then another, flinching as her skin met the gravel. But just as she crossed the shed's doorway, her eyes caught movement, something massive, brown, and waiting. A horse. A beautiful, muscular beast with a sheriff's star stitched on its saddle, tied to the shed door like it belonged there. Draped across the saddle was a note written in blunt pencil on torn parchment. "You gave away your shoes. Take mine." Beneath it, a pair of sturdy boots, sized to her feet, worn but clean and warm. Clara didn't cry often, but she wept that day, not from weakness, but from something deeper than gratitude, something like being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. She pressed the boots to her chest, stepped into them slowly, and climbed onto the sheriff's horse like she'd been doing it her whole life. With the reins in her hands and the wind in her skirt, Clara rode through the fields, no longer just the orphaned teacher. She was something else now. Someone who had been heard without speaking, lifted without asking, and empowered by nothing more than the proof that goodness, when given quietly, could still return like a sunrise on a frozen day. As she passed the town square, faces turned. People who once looked through her now watched her with something between shame and awe. The mayor stared from his office window, lips drawn tight, eyes unsure, but Clara didn't glance his way. She headed back toward the hills, back to the widow's cabin, to her little classroom in the dirt. And this time, she wouldn't limp. She wouldn't bleed. She would ride with pride, leaving behind a trail not of dust and pain, but of proof that kindness still had power in Broken Bluff. What the sheriff had given her wasn't just a horse. It was the first sign that the town was waking up, that its heart, buried beneath silence and self-interest, might still beat for justice, and that perhaps redemption was not a loud reckoning but a quiet return. By the time Clara arrived at the widow's cabin, the boys were already waiting, sitting upright on the porch with a stick they'd used to draw crooked letters in the dust. When they saw her arrive on horseback, they gasped and ran to meet her, not because she looked grand, but because she looked like hope. Clara dismounted slowly, wincing as her newly bandaged feet touched solid ground, but her boots held firm, and her hands remained steady as she unpacked her books. She taught them under a sycamore tree, the branches trembling above them, as if the world itself was leaning closer to listen. They read about rivers and dreams, and the kind of courage that doesn't roar. That afternoon, she left them with a promise she intended to keep, to return every week, no matter the season. But what Clara didn't know was that word of her horseback arrival had already swept through Broken Bluff like wildfire in dry grass. The sheriff hadn't just given her a horse, he had given her a stage. And now the town was watching. At the general store, old Miss Trudy whispered that maybe they had been wrong about Clara. The pastor's wife, once eager to see her dismissed, said she had felt something shift when Clara passed her porch. Even the mayor, rattled by the sheriff's silent rebellion, had called for a private meeting with the town council. There were murmurs of reinstatement, compensation, even an apology. But Clara, unaware of the tides turning behind her, spent the evening back in the blacksmith's shed, boiling water for her aching feet and sewing new patches onto her teaching satchel. The horse, which she now called Mercy, slept nearby, tethered but free in spirit. That night, Clara lit a candle and wrote a note to herself. "You are not invisible. You are not small. You are not broken." Then she blew out the flame and fell asleep with the echo of hoofbeats still in her chest. The next morning, a crowd gathered at the sheriff's office, not to protest, but to ask questions. Why had he given her his horse? Was she hired by the town again? Would she teach their children once more? The sheriff said nothing. He simply stepped aside and let the townsfolk make up their minds. Some were quick to defend her now, pretending they had always believed in her. Others shifted in discomfort, trying to reconcile their previous silence with this new wave of praise. But the sheriff didn't care for their convenience. He cared for what Clara had done. Given her last possession without fanfare, lifted a child without gain, and walked barefoot with grace no one else could match. 3 days later, Clara received a letter at her shed. It was sealed in red wax with the town's emblem, and it read like poetry written by a bureaucrat desperate for forgiveness. They wanted her to return to the schoolhouse. They promised wages, respect, and full control over her classroom. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it under her pillow, not out of pride, but because she needed time to listen to her own heart before answering. That evening, as she rode Mercy across the open field with the sunset spilling gold over the grass, she saw a dozen children running toward her, barefoot and breathless, carrying slates and chalk. They had come to learn, not because they were told to, but because they believed in her. She dismounted again, the pain in her legs forgotten, and taught them under the same sky where stars had just begun to bloom. One child asked her to teach them how to spell brave. She picked up a stick and wrote it slowly in the dirt, B-R-A-V-E. When she underlined it, her hand trembled, but not from weakness. It trembled from the knowledge that this was what she had been meant for all along. The next week began with an invitation Clara didn't expect and almost didn't believe. Delivered by a boy on a borrowed bicycle, it came folded in a linen envelope. No seal this time, no wax, no official crest. Just 4 soft words written in delicate cursive. Please join us tomorrow. Below it was the time and the place, Town Hall, 5 p.m. Clara stared at the note in her hand, wondering if the mayor had finally found his apology, or if this was another form of humiliation wrapped in politeness. She nearly tore it in half. But Mercy whinnied outside, pawing the earth like she understood that some steps forward are meant to be taken, even if they lead through old wounds. So Clara pressed her old skirt, wiped the dust from her boots, and prepared, not to beg, not to defend, but simply to stand tall. When she arrived at Town Hall, the scene took her breath away. The hall was packed, not with politicians or officers, but with parents, children, and even elders who had once called her just a spinster with a chalkboard. They stood as she entered. The sheriff nodded from the corner, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but calm. Clara hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time in years, the room waited on her. The mayor stood at the front, his voice shaky as he read from a prepared speech about education, service, and unseen heroes. But none of that mattered to Clara. What mattered was the wooden chair placed in the center of the hall, the teacher's chair, polished and strong. And beside it, not behind it, a second chair, the sheriff's, both empty, both waiting for her. She walked slowly, each step a rewriting of history. This time she wasn't being dismissed, she was being honored. And the hush in the room held its breath as Clara sat, not in the back corner, not in the audience, but at the center. The mayor stammered a bit, then declared what they were too late to realize. Clara was reinstated as head teacher of Broken Bluff, but this time, her role extended beyond the classroom. She would lead not only the children, but the entire town's new literacy initiative. She would train other teachers, oversee rural education, and receive a stipend larger than anyone before her. The sheriff, without saying a word, reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Inside was a key. To the schoolhouse. To her new home, and to the town's buried conscience. That night, Clara didn't ride back to the blacksmith's shed. She didn't return to worn blankets and leaking walls. She rode Mercy through Town Square, where children lit sparklers and elders clapped from porches. She passed the bakery where she used to buy day-old bread, now handing her fresh loaves as gifts. She passed the same well where she had once taken off her shoes, and saw that someone had placed a new bench there, with her name carved into the wood. For the one who walked barefoot so others could stand. Tears gathered in her throat, but didn't fall. Not yet. Inside her new cottage, a small brick house built behind the school, she found something waiting. Her old desk, her mother's photo, and a bundle of letters from her former students, sent from far-off towns and cities, thanking her for planting seeds that had become forests. She sat on the floor and read each one, the silence of the room swelling with memories. Outside, the sheriff lingered for a moment before tipping his hat and disappearing down the road. He didn't need to stay. He had already done what only the bravest do, not enforce justice, but restore it. And for the first time in her life, Clara slept in a bed she didn't borrow, under a roof she didn't fear, surrounded by walls not built of pity, but of purpose. Months passed like pages in a worn book, and the town of Broken Bluff began to change in ways no one could have predicted. Where there had once been indifference, there was now awakening. The schoolyard, once silent and overgrown, rang with laughter and recitation. Clara Rose stood at the front of the class, not just as a teacher, but as a legend, living proof that you don't need wealth or power to change a place, only the courage to give even when it costs everything. The mayor stepped down quietly, replaced by someone younger, someone raised in Clara's classroom. The townspeople, embarrassed by their past cruelty but eager to do better, began volunteering for her reading drives, planting community gardens, and sending their children to school not out of duty, but out of belief. And every Friday, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Clara would still ride Mercy out to the widow's cabin. There, under the sycamore tree, she taught those same two boys who once waited with sticks and dreams. Only now they were joined by dozens of others, children from farms and neighboring towns, all hungry for words and wonder. Parents gathered nearby, listening with quiet reverence to a woman who had walked through fire barefoot and never stopped moving forward. One morning, Clara woke early and stepped outside just as dawn was brushing the sky with rose and silver. She breathed in the cool air and looked out at the road that had once wounded her feet. There was no pain now, only memory. She walked down the path to the well where it all began. The bench with her name stood sturdy, and sitting on it was a new pair of shoes, small, hand-stitched, with little stars embroidered on the side. A note was tucked beneath the laces. It read, "For another little girl who walks brave." Clara looked up, and for the first time saw a young girl, barefoot, smiling and strong, waiting near the edge of the field, clutching a book to her chest. Clara knelt, offered the shoes, and watched the girl slip them on with quiet joy. And in that moment, Clara understood that she had become something far greater than a teacher. She had become a chain of kindness that would never break, a legacy passed through generations not by name, but by gesture. That same week, a newspaper reporter came from the city, drawn by the rumors of a sheriff's horse, a school rebuilt, and a woman who gave away her shoes. He didn't ask for a statement. He simply watched as Clara stood in front of her students, her skirt fluttering in the breeze, her boots covered in chalk and soil. His article, printed a week later, was titled, "The Town That Changed Because One Woman Walked." The story went further than anyone imagined, and donations began pouring in, books, supplies, scholarships. But Clara didn't want any of it for herself. She used every cent to build more schools, train more teachers, and send her brightest students to colleges far beyond Broken Bluff. Some of those students returned years later, not to repay her, but to continue what she started. As for the sheriff, he retired quietly, giving his badge to a young woman Clara once taught. When asked why he gave up his post, he simply said, "Because she already taught them everything they need to know." He moved to a small cabin by the river where he raised horses and lived in peace. But every time the school held a ceremony or opened a new classroom, he showed up, clean shirt, dusty boots, and a quiet pride in his eyes. On the anniversary of the day she gave away her shoes, the town declared it Clara Rose Day. Not with parades or speeches, but with one simple act. Every child in Broken Bluff brought an extra pair of shoes to school and placed them under a tree by the well, for someone who might need them, now or one day. Clara never asked for recognition. She never sought applause. But when she passed away years later, peacefully in her sleep, the town's church couldn't hold the crowd. They came from every corner of the state, from cities she'd never visited and places she'd only read about. And outside the church, tied to the railing, stood Mercy, old now, gray at the muzzle, eyes still watching. On her saddle was a ribbon that read, "She rode for us all." And so the orphaned teacher who gave away her shoes didn't vanish into silence. Her story rode on winds, walked through school doors, and echoed in every child who ever sat down to learn, knowing someone believed in them, long before they believed in themselves.